Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, well, it is time to take some of your questions, and we start once again with Martin on the Patreon, who asks, um, it seems to me CBC only ever refers to the Prime Minister as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, never as Prime Minister Trudeau, rarely as the Prime Minister. Is this a long-standing practice, or is it something he's just noticed? Um, I It's not something I've really paid much attention to be perfectly honest. Part of it, I think, is they use the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to differentiate him from his father, because there are people of a certain generation for whom Prime Minister Trudeau has a different connotation. So I think that's part of it. The whole thing about not referring to him as the Prime Minister was largely an election thing. Which I have strong feelings about, but that's pretty much over now. I know there's been a lot of people who are kind of worked up over this over Twitter. I don't really see it as much of an issue. Um, Take it for what you will. Yeah, there's not really too much I can really add there, but not really a big deal in any case. Our next question comes from Sandra on Twitter, who asks, why is Bonnie Henry's disastrous pandemic failure in BC seem to go unnoticed by the mainstream media in comparison to Kenny and Mo? That is kind of a good question. I think it has a lot to do with the first wave, where BC got off much easier, in particular because Bonnie Henry made some good calls early on around things like long-term care homes. But it's kind of fallen off the radar in subsequent waves. I think it's also simply because Kenny and Mo have been particularly egregious in kind of some of the stubbornness around insisting on doing the wrong thing, first of all. So there just hasn't been as much attention to Bonnie Henry and what's going on in BC. It's My understanding is, the BC numbers aren't quite as bad. I mean, BC hasn't really had to shift patients out of province or had their ICUs at the point of collapse. So that's probably where it is. But there are some good questions as to why people have not been paying attention to some of the things Bonnie Henry has been saying, and decisions she's made. So you do have a pretty good point there. Our next question is from Elizabeth on Twitter, who asks, interested to know what you think of the idea of the Liberals and NDP creating some kind of agreement to avoid a lost confidence vote for a few years. What would it entail in feasibility? So this is in reference to a piece that showed up in Maclean's on Friday, where there was this notion that the NDP and the Liberals are in discussions about a 3-year agreement on confidence. But if you read further down, this was not something that Trudeau and Singh had actually discussed, and it's some internal discussions among some NDPers and some Liberals, allegedly. I'm not going to put a lot of stock into this, in part because the NDP hate the Liberals. Really, this is a fundamental aspect of their whole raison d'etre, is just hating the Liberals. So I'm really not seeing where they think they're going to get enough quid pro quo out of doing any of this. And the Liberals know that the NDP are in no position to be, trying to engineer a confidence vote anytime soon, because the party is broke and they spent so much money in the last election for almost negligible results. So they've got their own problems, and Trudeau knows this, and so there's no real impetus for him to prop up the NDP in any case, because he knows that any of their threats are largely paper tiger right now. And he's also got options with the bloc to get support. So the feasibility is not really there. The seat math is not really there. It's not like we were in a marginal position like happened in BC or New Brunswick, where you had like 1 or 2 seats, and that supply and confidence agreement is what made the difference. We're not in that kind of a situation. So feasibility, I'm not seeing it. And, entailing some kind of a written agreement, even if it were theoretically possible. We saw that in BC, and then the governing NDP in BC eventually broke the agreement and went to an election. So, for what it's worth, I'm not seeing it, but it would be interesting if it happened, but I don't really see the feasibility or even the necessity for it. Next question from Brian, who asks, what are the chief barriers to universal pharmacare, and what would a national purchasing agency for pharmaceuticals achieve the same or similar benefits, perhaps to entice provinces without a provincial plan to create one? Biggest barrier is the provinces. This is provincial jurisdiction. Thus far, the federal government's planned national pharmacare system has a single province that has signed on, which is PEI. There is already a kind of purchasing agreement for pharmaceuticals between the federal government and several of the provinces, where they've been trying to essentially pool resources and buying power. This is going to be further developed in the Canadian Drug Agency, which is being created. The transition office is already in place. So the work to build the permanent office is well underway, and that will do things like bulk buying and developing a national formulary that would be essential as part of the universal pharmacare plan. So all that stuff is kind of in the works. What's really the holdup right now are provincial premiers. Our next question is from Linda, who asks, are there term limits as to how long one MP can serve on a committee? No, and generally it's a good idea that we have some continuity on committees, and there were certain MPs who had been on some of the lesser known committees for ages and ages and ages. Thinking of, David Christopherson when he was on public accounts. He'd been there for years and years until he retired. And so you can have MPs on these committees that build up a lot of expertise over time. That's generally a good thing. There are other MPs who are on committees who make a habit of beclowning themselves, and you just kind of have to deal with that and hope that maybe the party whip gets tired of it and assigns said MP to a different committee. But I wouldn't hold my breath, unfortunately. And final question from Dale Sherwood, who asks, can 2 provinces join together to create a single entity under the Constitution, or did it even contemplate that occurrence? They can. It requires a constitutional amendment. I'm not sure if it's the 750 formula, so 7 provinces with 50% of the population, or if it's unanimous consent. But yes, they can do that. This is also the whole notion of secession. So if Quebec wanted to separate, that would also require a constitutional amendment, which is what the whole secession reference to the Supreme Court was all about, which, as you may have heard recently, Jason Kenney tried to use a referendum under the same rubric for equalization, which was not the same thing and is not what that Supreme Court reference actually said, but that was what the logic was in between there. Also, just kind of as a side note that's interesting, is the constant talk about trying to get Turks and Caicos into Confederation happens You have different provinces who are saying, oh, they can join us, so they don't need the constitutional amendment, and the Turks and Caicos would become part of Nova Scotia or Saskatchewan, because yes, that is something Saskatchewan has actually proposed. So that's kind of a workaround there, but generally, yes, if you want to merge provinces, that would require a constitutional amendment. And that's everything for this week. Thank you all for your questions. You can find me at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.